let's kind of start this from scratch. So welcome to the live stream for today. Kind of excited about this one. It is fall officially as of a few days ago now, I guess. And I always get a kick out of these gourds at this time of year. They're always kind of crazy looking and very pretty, lovely greens, lovely yellows on some of them. Obviously, we get into a lot of other earth colors and things like that. But I went to a little market, a little farmer's market that's just about 4 minutes away from my house the other day, and went sifting through their bin. And I found this lovely little one here, which I was quite enamored with. It's got some really beautiful colors on it. And I was kind of smitten with the shape of it because it's, I do paint an awful lot of birds. And it has a bit of a goose-like shape to it, which I really quite liked. So I picked it. Color, shape, they both were really kind of fun for me. So this is what I'm gonna work on today. Before I do that, once again, I want to thank you all for choosing to join me on Patreon and take part in these live streams. I want to keep doing these. Want to keep doing them every month. I do intend to make some adjustments to the tiers on Patreon, things that are going to be of, I think, more benefit to people. This is kind of my first time putting one of these up, and I just kind of threw some things together, and I think it needs a little bit of tweaking. I want to incorporate some kind of monthly Q&A, but I am also open to some suggestions from people. Feedback is great. I can only pretend to know what I think people want. So if you want to put some comments up in Patreon with some suggestions that you think might bring more benefit to you, I would really appreciate that. So without further ado, let's get moving here. So I have chosen to do this in one of my sketchbooks. It's a little Stillman and Burn. It's about a 5.5 by 8.5 size, and it's the Alpha series. So it's takes mixed media, watercolor washes, that sort of thing. It's a fairly smooth paper. It's not as smooth as, say, a hot press. It's got a little bit of tooth to it. I do have to work the washes pretty quickly on here because it will soak into the paper pretty fast, and you can get edges if you're a little too slow. But I think for what we're doing here, and with the drying time of this type of paper, it'll work very well for this gourd. I tend to paint fairly loose most of the time, and I think that this will require a little bit of detail. So I chose this sketchbook specifically to work on this gourd. Now I'll bring the gourd down here. I have chosen to draw it already, and I have taken a photograph of this, and I'll probably put it up into the Patreon thing. What I have drawn first and foremost was the overall shape of the gourd. Not terribly difficult. I mean, really, you're just looking at a bit of an oval shape, maybe slightly ovoid, and then a long tube with a round edge, and then this little thing up at the tip there. So it's not a terribly difficult shape to draw. And once you get the overall shape done, it's really just kind of adding things in there. And then kind of, what are those things? I start to focus on the hues and the dark shapes primarily first. So I kind of roughed in this large dark shape here, some of these little lines, some of these little breaks between the yellow and the green, and there's some little nibbly bits that have some darker shadows, I draw the darker shadows in, just things to kind of help know where the paint's going to go. Because once I start painting, I will go to this, which I'm just going to end up having just above me there, and I will make most of my decisions from that. But I will also start to just kind of look at what's happening on the paper and work from there as well. Let's talk a little bit about the color here before I start mixing it up. So we have yellows and we have greens, and we have a mixture of each. I work with a split primary palette, so I keep a warm and a cool yellow in my palette. And I also keep a range of greens, from a warmer green to a mid green to a cool green, which is almost a turquoise. So I'm going to be using those to kind of get in the ballpark. I don't generally get too fixated on the exact hue that's going on. I just get a general idea of the hue, and then I'll just go from there. So on that note, I'll always start with the lighter colors. And that means I'm going to start with my cool yellow. And when I say cool, I don't mean cool like it's like a lemon yellow or whatever. I tend to use a mid yellow, like a Hansa yellow medium. It does change sometimes. If you have any questions at all while I'm doing this, feel free to put them into the chat. Put the water in my well, and then I'll add my paint. And I'm really just trying to make sure that I don't mix up anything that's going to be way too strong, because I can always add value on top of it later. Now, I'm going to paint the yellow area, but I'm also going to kind of take it up through some of the green area too, because the green that's in these sections does have a yellow undertone. So I can justify just kind of coming in through here and even going over some of the darker areas, because it's going to have a nice warm undertone. Maybe like a yellow goose here. I probably can't see it from your angle, but I can already pick up on it here. Up in the top area where I have painted, it's already started to settle in. That's how quickly some of these little sketchbooks papers will absorb, which means that I don't want to go up there again with my brush right now, because then you'll start seeing a bunch of brush strokes and all that sort of noise. Yeah, may as well just come. I'm just going to go right through here actually. So I can just push the darker values. With a subsequent wash later. Again, it's pretty important, especially when you're working with papers like this, that do dry pretty quick. That you pay attention to the moisture on the paper. Just pulling a little bit of paint there. I'm going to pull just a little bit here. I'm just looking at the moisture on the paper and it's still quite damp. And I make sure that I don't have a lot of moisture in the brush. Very dry. Well, very damp to dry, I guess is a better term. So I've got a nice little wash on there. I'm going to need a little bit more value on it, but for now, that's pretty good. And what I'm going to do is start getting the next little bit of yellow sorted. And I'm going to use my warmer yellow for that. Again, I just go up. I have a little towel just up top here. Just slide that down a little. Actually, maybe I'll just adjust this down a bit. And what I'm going to do then, I think this is dry enough. My brush isn't really loaded. I've got it loaded with paint and I controlled the moisture on there. And I'm just going to bring some of this warmer yellow, and I'm just using the very tip of my brush. I'm just going to bring this around. You can see if this were 100% cold press or any other types of papers that I will normally paint on, I wouldn't dare to go on here yet. It would still be very wet and I would not get the edges that I just got. They would have all kind of blended and gone all over the place. So another one of the reasons why I chose this paper for today. So we get a little bit of definition on there. And then I'm going to move up top and start bringing in some green. What I'm using is, it's like a permanent green light. And I'm just going to tone it down a little bit and then take some of the brightness out of it. So I want a nice bright green. Well, I want a nice yellow green, but I don't want it to be too bright. So I need to tone it down because the permanent green light is quite bright. And I can just bring this. That's good for the undergreens in here. You can see how that yellow kind of comes through and how the fact that I painted the yellow on here first is really of no consequence. Still, I am kind of avoiding a little bit of the darker areas now, just because as I build value, they're going to get a little tougher to see. Another little tip, when you're doing things like this, if you look at the photograph I took of this thing, because you don't have the gourd in hand, you can see how the shape moves, right? So if you notice, I'm kind of moving my brush in the direction of the shape of the gourd itself. That way, if you do, I haven't really in this, but if you do get some little brush strokes and things like that, they're going to be in the direction of the gourd. And that means that the edges that they'll create will add some texture in the direction that I would want it, as opposed to trying to just fill this side to side. And you might have some really odd marks on the gourd. In this manner, any marks that I would create, which it can happen with these sketchbook type papers, they'll be moving the right way for me. And that'll be the same as I move down and through the lower area of the gourd too. And I really actually quite like the green that I just ended up with. So I thought I might shift it down here, but I like it so much, I'm just going to keep it. You can see how I'm coming up against that yellow, and the yellow has settled in. And then once again, I'm moving my brush in the direction of the gourd itself. I really hope I'm saying the word gourd right. Gourd, maybe that's not correct. It gets a little bit darker there. Some of these areas over here get quite dark, so I'm just gonna sort of leave those. And just kind of keep this lighter, warm green. If I get a little bit outside of the lines, it's no big deal. And then we're gonna add this section under here, which is really all kind of green. There's a soft edge back here that I want to keep, so I'll leave that for now. All these edges, they're fairly hard, so I can just kind of come through here and paint these in. Just keeping through the shape. If you notice, I am really just sticking to the tip of my brush. I'm not really pushing this thing too hard into the surface, which I feel is pretty important, right? If I push too hard, I risk shifting the layer that's underneath. I don't really want to do that. There's some kind of mid values in and around here, and I'll just drop some of this warm green in. And I can do that the same way that I've justified doing the yellow and then putting the green on top of it, and it still looks fine, right? I know that the colors I'm going to be building up on there are going to have stronger value, darker values as well. So if I need to deal with it and hide it later, I'll be able to do that. So when you build all the colors up, it just makes for a deeper rendering. Now here's where that little soft edge is. So I'm just going to drop a little value here. The soft edge kind of comes in and blends with some yellow in the background. Not the background, but the side there. So I'll just drop that in. Clean my brush real quick, get most of the moisture out. And I'm just going to just soften that a little bit. There we go. And we'll continue on down into some of this area that really gets quite shadowy later. And I think that's going to work out pretty good for most of what I want to do. This will get darker here. This all gets pretty dark. And these all are very blue-green. So just in a quick couple passes, I've got most of my lighter values. I'm just going to make sure that this is dry. It's a little bit damp. I've now got 2 layers on there, so the paper is still a little damp. And what I'm going to do while that's settling down is grab a little bit more water. And I'm going to take that green value and I'm going to make it a little less yellow. So grabbing that, actually I think it's a phthalo yellow green. I'm going to go more with the permanent green. This is permanent green. You see it's quite bright. And so I'm going to dull it down. I'm going to dull it down with an earth orange. And maybe just a little bit more. I think that'll work. When in doubt, swatch it out. I could maybe go a little bit more. I want it a little bit stronger, so I'm just going to go a little bit more green and a little bit more. Yeah, a little bit more green. Yeah, I think that works. Okay, so now I'm going to go on here. Let's check out the paper surface. It's damp down there. It's workable up here. And there's so many different greens and layers and textures in this that it's really just going to be about building up value. And I'm not going to fill so much with this one because I want to reveal some of the lighter value underneath. And these are all just kind of things that I didn't really draw in. You just kind of go in and just do them with the brush. Then we start to get a little bit more texture showing up on this gourd. And I'll kind of move that down into here. It is a little still damp down here. It's a little bit soft, some of these edges. So I'm going to have to be a little careful. and really just trying to grab the little bristles of my brush and just create some little lines and textures in here as these little striations of green work their way through the gourd. And drop a little bit more value back up in here. And come back and just kind of soften some of this up. Now I will load my brush up and we'll come down the other side over here. Just building value. There's kind of some in here as well. I can leave that as a shape. It's important too to make sure that you control the moisture of your brush, because you see these little fine lines that I'm getting as I go down here. If I didn't control the moisture, I'd have a really wet brush and I'd just be throwing a bunch of paint down on here and I would have little to no control over what's the tip of my brush. So that little towel that I keep just above there is quite often the star player in anything that I'm painting. And I'm just really filling in the big areas, and then out towards the edges where there's some texture, that's where I'm just sort of flitting the brush through and just creating little tiny marks that will read as texture. And then you can see kind of how you have the first wash and then the next wash, well, the first wash being the yellow one, I guess the first wash of the green being that one. But again, it's all about just building value. In some of these areas where it does get darker later, I'm not going to worry so much about trying to preserve much of what's going on there. This area gets darker. This area here will get quite dark, but I can probably bring this down across here now. I don't think I'm going to lose it anymore. Let's see. That area is going to get darker. There's kind of some shadowy green back here. We'll just go back to our little getting a little less concerned with saving all the darks because some of these values are starting to work out now. Some green over there and there, and that's coming along. Just give that a couple seconds. Does anybody have any questions at all right now? Feel free if you do. Doing pretty good. I'll probably have this done in an hour. All right, so I'm gonna start looking at the darker green. All this green all in here. And it's kind of up here, and it's these darker lines as well. So it's all throughout the gourd. And I'm really just gonna take some blue, add some blue into this, and some more green, and some more blue. I'm using ultramarine, right? So ultramarine is further away from the greens that I'm using. So if you want the brightest color when you're mixing, you want to use a nice close pairing. But I'm not really interested in a bright green because this is not a bright green. It's kind of dull, but it's dark. So it means I need lots of pigment. So I take this thing kind of blue, and then again, I'm going to want to dull it down. And I inadvertently used an earth red there. I'm going to switch back to the earth orange. And that starts to give me something I think that's going to work pretty well. Oh, good. Right, Beth, I'm glad to hear that. So we take a look at it. I think that that works pretty nicely. And I'm just going to pick up a little bit of water in my brush and just move this over here in the third well, just so it's a little bit lighter. And I'm going to take this and just not quite light enough. Put a little bit more water in my brush. Control the moisture here. And control the moisture enough. Those little big puddles that you see showing up in here, those can really create a problem, especially in a sketchbook like this. And I want this a little bit lighter, so I'm just pulling the moisture out of my brush and I'm just going to run this just along the top. Suck that little droplet out there. So now I've got the start of my cooler green. So these have all been pretty warm. Everything in here has been pretty warm. And then this green that we're now going to put on top is definitely starting to the cooler side. So I did kind of save these little spots here so I can kind of see where I'm going. And I just want to make sure that as I go through these, that I'm getting rid of the white. I'm gonna move this over a little bit. I can probably move this over a little bit too. Now, is it as strong as it needs to be? Not necessarily. Does it matter? Nope, not at all. Not in the least. I would rather put a value that's too light down, and then I can go back and adjust that after. And even though I'm painting a gourd, now the difference between this and a lot of the other things that I generally paint is I'm using way more hard edges in this than I do in most things. I tend to prefer a lot of soft edges and loose brushwork and that sort of thing. But this little ornamental gourd is, it's got a lot of stuff. It's got a lot of detail, and I think that those are the kind of things that really make this thing interesting. So I've kind of chosen to really focus on rendering some of those. I'm not going to get too carried away. This isn't going to be a hyper realistic gourd. It might look a little, maybe. I don't know. What do I know? But now I'm really trying to hone in on some of the darker shapes that I rendered with the pencil. And the way that I kind of worked through, I left some of those so that they're easier for me to see as I come back in here now and paint. It's like a little nubbin thing there that I think is kind of interesting. So just make a quick few little brush marks there, and that seems to do the trick. Once you come in with the darks, it really does start looking kind of cool. All right. I'm not going to have enough dark. I have to start up here and then I'll mix some more. It's going to come down. There's like a little thin bit, and this whole area here is a nice little pocket of shadow. So we'll just kind of get in here and sort of create some of that. And then I'll mix up some more paint. So going through and leaving these little lighter areas is akin to a bit of a shorthand. So I can just kind of track back through here without having to, redo or rethink anything. That thought process is already done. And I'm choosing to make sure that my brush is not too loaded. That allows me to get a bunch of little texture with my brush as I move through here. It will hopefully mimic some of the texture that is in here. Going through some of these little lighter areas and just trying to get a little bit of value in them. So that's starting to look good. Now I'm going to mix up a lot more here. So I'm going to grab some of my permanent green and some ultramarine. And then some earth orange, which I think is either, I mean, burnt sienna is a pretty good option for an earth orange. Nice and inexpensive as well. Burnt siennas, earth pigments tend to be a little less. I think that what I'm using here is a burnt sienna light right now. I often use quinacridone burnt orange, but while I love it, sometimes when I'm teaching, it's a little bit frustrating for people because it comes down pretty bright, and then it does dull quite nicely. But when people watch what I'm doing, and if they're trying to work along, then it's like, ooh, mine's not bright enough, and then they'll end up going to orange, and then it doesn't shift or dull as it dries, and they end up with something that looks a little bit weird. So burnt sienna light tends to stay similar in hue. It does dull a bit more than it looks when it immediately goes on down, but it's just a little bit more friendly. Okay, so I'm going to finish off the darks here. Now that I've got a bunch more, I'm going to be doing two kind of passes of dark. Actually, I want to double check this and just make sure that I'm close. It's a little bit warmer, so maybe a bit more blue. Kind of cool it down. And it's feeling pretty thick too, so I'm just going to put a touch of water in there. Yeah, that'll work. It's very close. I mean, these things are natural. Some of these greens shift a little bit from each other, so that's no big deal. Actually, that is really strong. And this is kind of the focal point in this, so got some little white highlights in here that I'm going to try to preserve. By simply just painting around them. And you see what I'm doing too is I kind of came down to this little point over here, and then I went over, started adding a little bit of paint here, and I want to be mindful of where the edges are. I mentioned earlier that, you know, when you're working in sketchbooks like this, they are fairly absorbent, and this paint will just start to soak in here pretty quick, and it will very quickly, it's a lot of use of the word quick, but it will rapidly, how about that? We'll just start digging into the thesaurus here. Rapidly create some hard edges that, you know, you want them, they're great. But when you don't want the hard edges showing up, they're very frustrating. So the only way you can do that is by maintaining a damp edge. And so I will often just pop across my washes and just continue down. Now, in a sketchbook like this, it's going to create some interesting little effects, constantly going back. You do need to be careful with how much moisture you have on your brush. Because if I pop back and forth and my brush is really wet, every time I release the brush, it's going to drop a little puddle down into my painting. So again, the towel, the star player. You can see how much stronger this value is, which is totally fine because I mentioned with the other ones that I was going to be going stronger on it. This one just kind of gets me there a little bit quicker. It's all good, but it's still not too strong. I still have an option to come in and do some other things. And you can see I can layer this on top down here. And it's a really nice little addition to the value. Yeah, it looks pretty cool. So while that's all settling in, let's pop up and go up here. And I did save that one little value. There's some little marks all throughout this, little dots, things like that. When you're looking and trying to paint from an item, just observe that they're there and then just try to create a version of them. Don't get too fixated on thinking where exactly is that dot, where is that one, and this needs to be in that spot. Just get the idea and go. Okay, so now we've got some nice little darks that we want to put in. As Bob Ross would say, happy. Maybe he wouldn't say this. Happy little darks? I don't know. Doesn't seem very Bob Rossy. There we go. And let's see where else. I'm gonna bring this along the edge here. These darkers get a little bit more, I don't know, haggard, rough. So I'm really just kind of creating that edge and then just getting some texture along the bottom. As long as you focus on rendering values, it's pretty tough to not end up with something that's going to look interesting. It's the values that make a lot of this stuff. And what I'm hoping, at least what I'm planning, I guess that's kind of the same thing in this case, is once I get all the hues down, what I intend to do is just kind of wash over the shadow side and just pop those in. Okay, so that's kind of going to sit there for a little bit. And we'll come along the top, and I'm just going to pop into this dark area again. This needs to be stronger. Again, like I said, it's always a good idea to go light. You can always adjust it. So there I can pop in and make those stronger. If I went in with too thick a paint, I'm just like, I can't be bothered. It's going to end up darker anyways. And then you make it too strong by accident, I think watercolor is easy to correct if you paint lighter. You paint too heavy, then it can be very hard. Like too strong a value. It's when you need to remove values from watercolor that things get sketchy, for lack of a better term. So I've just taken that dark and added some water to it. And I'm just kind of running down some of these little spots here. There's just some interesting little textures. I'm really just kind of dancing the brush. Wow, my goodness. Dancing the brush through there and just getting some little value. Okay, so this is a little damp, more damp than I would like at this point. I'm just gonna let some of that color sit for just a moment. I need to get this area a lot darker. To bring up some value in here and darken some of this over here. This is actually sitting pretty good, but I'm gonna go a little bit darker on a couple of these spots. Just gonna let it sit for a second. If you have some questions, right now is a good time. And if you don't, that's fine too. But once this sits for a second, I'm gonna take a hair dryer and make sure it's completely dry. I'm gonna go over top and layer it up. Okay, so pardon the noise for a moment. Okay, so I'm going to start really focusing on some of the other dark areas because this area here, because of the shadow on it, ends up being quite dark. The lighting's a bit different than where I have it positioned, but this area in here is quite dark. This area's got a nice dark edge around it, and there's going to be some darks underneath these little nubbins up here that I need to put in. Which earlier gourd? This one? It's up on Instagram. So I'm really just going to pop through here and just add a little bit more value to it. Um, um, I might have posted it on Patreon, I think. Take a look. Just give me a second. You don't do Instagram, huh? Next thing you can tell me you're not on TikTok either. I'm just teasing. A little bit more value in there. I need to figure something out here. I'm starting to the battery warning. Excuse me for just one moment. I just got to go get a cable to plug my laptop in. All right, crisis averted. Sorry about that. Um, okay, so we've got some more value down here. And then I'm going to pop down the left side here. I'm going to bring a little bit of value on the outer side. And then I'm going to bring a little bit more into, it's a bit too damp. Again, this is just kind of now just popping in, and I could come in here and do a little with some pencil and things like that after, but I'm probably just going to try and do it all with watercolor. I mean, when you're painting these, you can kind of do really whatever you want. There we go. That's nice. It's starting to come together. Okay, so it is a little damp again. And I will check, I'm just going to check for a second while it's drying. Posts. Yeah, I don't have the gourd up there, but it is up on the Instagram. I've got the reference. I'll chuck it up there. Okay, so it is kind of damp. I don't know if you can see that or not, but it is got a little bit of shine on it. But some areas that don't have some shine on it are these yellow areas. So while this kind of settles down for a moment, I'm actually going to go in here and just put a little bit more yellow in there. Now, the early yellow I used earlier is pretty bright. And what I'm going to do is just take that yellow, add a little bit of ochre into it, which is a duller yellow, earth yellow, right? And we're just going to kind of bring some of that in here. And again, I'm just moving the brush in the direction of the gourd. Bring that down here. And once I have some of those little marks in there, I'm just going to quickly just come in and just try and soften some of that. It's okay if it gets a little bit modelly, that's no big deal. And I'll bring that right around towards the edges of all this nonsense. And then I'm going to take a little bit more of that warm yellow that I had used earlier and just put in a little extra value. Maybe I need to get some more paint. Should be pretty thick. There we go. There's like just some little kind of undulations in here that give it a slightly different value in some spots. I'm not going to get too worried about it. Put some more value there and bring this right down through here as well. And so we're getting there. It's a little bit more orange on here. I want a little bit more yellow on mine. I kind of like it. So now I'm going to take some neutral tint and just add that into my dark here and just make this that much more darker. And then what I want to do is try to carefully render some of these little nodes that are on this thing. they're all kind of round. So I'm just kind of creating little round shapes around these little highlights that I left. I mean, if you're really worried about making this look photorealistic, then you're just going to spend maybe a little bit more time working a few more values and things like that into these little nodes. But I'm not, it's already actually looking pretty good, I think. Hopefully what you're picking up out of this too is that it really is all about the layering. I mean, you look really closely at a lot of the stuff that I'm putting in here, and it's just little abstract shapes, right? I'm just looking where some darks are and just adding some darks where there's darks, lights where there's lights, and eventually it just starts to look more and more real. Keep this. This will kind of be the biggest, darkest area. Maybe a little bit down here too. Yeah, I was wrong. A little bit more than an hour. Okay, I just want to do a couple things. I'm just going to grab a little bit of that green I was using earlier, and I'm going to warm it up with some and what I'm after is just a little bit of value up in here. A little bit there. Just using some of the darker and lighter greens. Just kind of some little marks all along this little spine, ridge, whatever you want to call it. This area is too bright. Some of it I'll keep. Just bring that down. And then a lot of this area is too bright too, but once this is dry, I'm going to put a wash right across this. Bring the shadow out. So on that note, I'm just going to give it a dry. does not take long with the sketchbook paper. I'll just get rid of this yellow here. I don't know that I really need it anymore. And what I want is just a nice gray that I can put in here. So I'm going to grab a good chunk of water, and I'm going to start with neutral tint. And I want this to be a little bit warmer. So I'm just going to put some sepia into it. Most neutral tints tend to be pretty warm. I mean, cool. So, and I just want to check it. Make sure it's not too strong. I think that'll work pretty good. I just want it to be fairly neutral. Because if it's not, then, I mean, most of the stuff is green. So if it's blue, it's going to make the yellow come across as a little bit more green, which isn't that big a deal. I'm just going to do a quick pass with that down here. And try to get this whole shadow side first. Now, I am very gently bringing my brush across these shapes. And that's really the key. Otherwise, you're going to lose it in there. And my brush is moving very lightly across the surface so that I don't disturb too much. You can see some of it softening a little, but that's okay. Let that settle for a moment. And I'll do the same just on the underside up here. A little bit of value there. Clean the brush. And just soften that out. Anywhere there's a little bit of value, I'm just going to bring that in. A little bit of warmth and shadow. Just making some little pulls. There we go. And then I'm going to bring that down here. And if I lose some of all the edges down in here, it's not that big a deal because it just helps to bring some of the focus more to this area. But it was feeling quite light. And now what I'm going to do is take a little damp brush, just try to bring some of this green in, soften some of these little super yellow highlights. Makes those look a little bit better. And we'll give it a dry. I think that'll be good. Just take a little look. And maybe what I'm gonna do is just pop in just a little bit more dark on top of this. Bring some of these little more defined edges back. I didn't really lose them there too much. That's all good. And put a little bit of water in this. And just bring some of the shadow back down on the very bottom here, and I think that that'll be done. I'm gonna leave that. All right. So there we go. Little fall gourd, nice little bit of value over on this side, some nice darks, some fun greens, some nice yellows. It's got some nice texture. I think it looks pretty good. It doesn't, I'm not gonna hold that near it and go, they don't look the same. They look pretty similar.